Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to this tribute to Amos Oz. My name is Clémence Boulouque. I'm the Carl and Bernice Witten Associate Professor of Jewish and Israel Studies at Columbia University, and it is a great pleasure to be joined today by our wonderful speakers. Professor Fania Oz-Salzberger is a historian of idea who wrote Jews and Words with her father Amos. Professor Robert Alter, he's a professor emeritus of Hebrew and comparative literature at the University of California, Berkeley, and the author of a biography of Amos Oz that will appear in the fall with Yale Jewish Lives. And Sir Simon Schama, professor of art history and history at Columbia University, is the author of 20 books, including The Story of the Jews, and the writer, presenter of over 50 documentaries on art, history, and literature for BBC television. Throughout this hour of conversation, we will also hear from a handful of writers, publishers, and artists who will pop up and share some thoughts on and memories of Amos Oz. But let us start now with a short presentation of Amos's life and work.
I write because I have no choice. For me to write, the need to write is like the need to dream. I have no choice whether to dream or not to dream. I must dream at night.
Amos Klausner was born in Jerusalem on May 4th, 1939. His librarian father instilled in him a love of books, and his mother's stories about places far removed from the arid environment of Palestine inspired him to write. His mother died by suicide shortly before his bar mitzvah, an event which haunted Amos for his entire life. Aged 14 and a half, he reinvented himself by going to live on a kibbutz, where he changed his surname to Oz. Here, he met his wife Nili and started writing his first books at night, after work. He soon became one of Israel's major authors and the nation's moral compass. In 1986, Amos moved his family to Arad on the edge of the Negev desert, as his son suffered from severe asthma. He began his day with a walk in the desert at 4 a.m. before sitting down to write. Amos wrote 13 novels, including what he called his autobiographical novel, A Tale of Love and Darkness, several collections of short stories, plus stories for children and countless essays. In 2013, Amos moved his home to Tel Aviv, where he died on December 28, 2018. His books are translated into some 40 languages and earned him several of the world's most prestigious literary prizes.
All right, so we will explore four main themes in this conversation. First, Amos's relation to Hebrew, then his youth in Israel, his life in the kibbutz, and his multifaceted teaching. But let's start with the foundations of his literature, which is Hebrew. So in the beginning, there was Hebrew. And my first question is to Fania Oz-Salzberger. In Jews and Words that you co-wrote with your father, and that was published in 2012, one reads, "R is not a bloodline, but a text line." And I'd like to hear you about it. But also, since the first Hebrew text is the Bible, I was wondering about the nature of your father's relationship to the Bible and to biblical Hebrew in general.
Well, first I want to thank Katya Shelley and everyone involved in organizing this wonderful event. I'm sitting in Tel Aviv now, it's evening, and the gay pride parade is marching outside. And I can tell you what my father would have said. He would have said, these young people, these wonderful young people are using the words cherut, chofesh, zchut, liberty, freedom, right? One of these words is biblical, the other one is biblico-mishnaic, and the third is mishnaic. He would have known right away where to place these words. He swam in the ocean of biblical and mishnaic and Talmudic and medieval and early modern and modern Hebrew, like a fish in the sea, just like a fish in the sea. And I will give one childhood memory. Whenever we stepped out of the shower, Galia and I, he loved to sniff our scent of soap and immediately say, "The scent of my daughter is like the smell of a field that has been blessed by God." Robert Alter would be able to tell you exactly where in Genesis this comes from changing son to daughter. So I grew up the way he grew up. He grew up with his learned father and his very literary mother, within the great ocean of multi-generational Hebrew. He didn't just love Hebrew, he breathed biblical and post-biblical Hebrew.
And so, since you mentioned Professor Alter, I was wondering about this revival of Hebrew in Amos Oz. What are the different layers of modern and biblical Hebrew, and how did he incorporate them in his writing? He breathed Hebrew, and how does that breath inspire his writing?
Well, first, I would like to resist the word revive.
Mm-hmm.
For a simple reason. Amos Oz began writing for publication in his early 20s, at the beginning of the 1960s. And by then, the revival of Hebrew was fully in place. There were some great works of literature that had already been written. Agnon, whom he admired, and Samach Yizhar, with whom he became good friends just 3 years before the 1960s, had published a massive stream of consciousness novel in a very rich Hebrew, the Days of Ziklag.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Fania is absolutely right that it wasn't just the Bible, but all these different layers of Hebrew. And in A Tale of Love and Darkness, Amos writes that he was first exposed to a kind of Hebrew different from the ones that the kids were speaking out on the streets when he studied at the age of 10 with teacher Zelda, Hamora Zelda, who was an ultra-Orthodox woman from a distinguished Hasidic family, a very original personality, and as it turned out later, one of the finest Hebrew poets of her generation. And she exposed him to these earlier layers of Hebrew, which were then reinforced by the Orthodox school that his parents had sent him to. So he played with all these layers, although the matrix, I think, is definitely modern Hebrew. I would add that he had an almost preternatural gift for the Hebrew language. The first few times I heard him speak in public was in America, and of course he spoke in English. His English was excellent. But then I was part of the celebration on the occasion of his retirement from Ben Gurion University in Beersheba, and he got up to speak. And he was speaking impromptu, and the flood of eloquence that came out of him just made my head spin. I would say occasionally in his writing, the extraordinary facility for Hebrew was a bit of a danger for him. He could overdo things, but he was one of the masters of Hebrew prose.
Thank you, Professor Alter. So if the multiple layers of Hebrew are so central in Amos's work, one of the questions, he spoke perfect English, as you mentioned, but what is it like to render Amos's Hebrew into English? So let's now listen to Amos' trusted translator for 50 years, Nicolas Delange.
The Hebrew language is a very old language, and it exists in layers, layer upon layer. And the oldest layer is the Bible, but the Bible is very much a living part of modern Hebrew writing, and especially for a writer like Amos Oz, who is well educated in all the layers of Hebrew. Now, this is a very difficult feature of Hebrew to translate, because the words of the Bible are more familiar to a modern Hebrew audience than to a modern English audience. Today, we have many different translations of the Bible in English. I tend to keep to the words of the King James Bible because I think they're more familiar, particularly to an older audience. And in certain books by Amos, the Bible is very much to the fore. I'm thinking particularly of the book, The Same Sea, a book which is about love and death, and which relies very heavily, particularly on the words of the Song of Songs. And I actually went further than I normally go, and I added a sort of appendix at the end, a list of some of the biblical phrases which I thought might not be familiar to English-speaking audiences. Now, the part of the Bible which is in Hebrew and which is familiar to Hebrew audiences is the so-called Old Testament. But it may surprise some people to know that Amos also uses the words of the New Testament. Now, this is a text which is not familiar to Hebrew audiences. Here I'm thinking of the book Touch the Water, Touch the Wind, which has quite a number of quotations and allusions to the words of the New Testament. Here, my task was much easier, in a sense, because the words are more familiar to English readers than to Hebrew readers. And it's a feature of his writing which is perhaps not very well known. The difficulty of translating biblical Hebrew in the context of modern Hebrew is that it is quite archaic language, and sometimes the words don't mean exactly the same as they mean in modern Hebrew. So one has to adjust, adapt, twist and bend and shape the words so that they fit the modern context. And for me, this has been one of the most interesting challenges in translating Amos Oz into English.
All right, so a challenge, but also an opportunity, obviously. Hebrew was a dividing line between Amos and his parents. It was a native language, but also a foreign language for his European-born parents who, like many in that generation, remained strangers in a strange land. We have the beautiful anecdote of the grandmother of Amos, also, who was obsessed with microbes. But this brings us to the dual genesis at the heart of Amos's work, of the genesis of his writing and of the country. And I'd like to now address my question to Sir Simon Schama. How would you describe this relationship between young Amos Oz and the fledgling state of Israel, the other giving birth to the country and the country giving birth to the other?
Well, I think that's absolutely right, Clémence, but I think he's always going from one vision of the relationship between Jewish history and the founding of the state of Israel, which is sort of rooted in a literary kind of Zionism, really, but also very much kind of grounded in an enormous palimpsest of literature, a bookish Judaism, if you like. I mean, it's very telling in A Tale of Love and Darkness. Amos at one point says, I didn't want to be a writer, I actually wanted to be a book. Yeah, and he talks about his father being physically enamored of the book, smelling it and holding it, and he's rather the same way. That one of the great set scenes in The Love of Tale and Darkness is when he goes to great uncle Josef Klausner, and there is no room almost for any kind of life forms except huge, immense piles of book. And he describes in a very Amos Oz way wonderfully that Klausner's desk is like a battleship or a cruiser moored in an ocean. So he's deeply Jerusalemite in that way, in a sort of Tolpiot way. But then, of course, actually, he makes a great break. I mean, a lot of his work is about the break to go to a kibbutz when he's 15, to kibbutz Hulda. But when he gets to kibbutz Hulda, he tells us that in the evenings and the nights, what does he do? He reads and reads and reads and reads. So he's such a kind of ironist, I think, actually, about the impossibility of totalizing either one version, a bookish Jewish life, of being obsessed with it, and sees his father, I think, a little tragically, as someone, you know, who absolutely lives for the moment when he'll see the physical book really appear. And he's both touched and saddened by that. And equally the impossibility of leading your life totally in a kibbutz. I mean, there's that wonderful passage again in Tale of Love and Darkness when he says, when I left home and went to live in a kibbutz, because it's funny. I mean, much of the kind of most piercing ironies in Amos's work, I think, are comic, but they're kind of seriously comic, if that's not too much of an oxymoron. I wrote down some resolutions I set for myself as a test that I absolutely must not fail. If I really was to begin a brand new life, I must start by getting a tan within a fortnight so that I look just like one of them. I must stop daydreaming once and for all. I must change my surname, which I did. I must take 2 or 3 cold showers every day. I must absolutely force myself to give up doing that filthy stuff at night. I must not write any more poems. I must stop chattering, and I must not tell stories. I must appear in my new home as a silent man. And that sort of theme about redemptive silence comes back in A Perfect Peace, where Azaria Gitlin, this sort of strange, sort of low-key messianic figure, young man, wanders into the kibbutz from which the hero of the book is desperately trying to exit. And he explains that what draws him to the kibbutz is the ability to relax, to calm down, to stop talking, in fact. And I think sort of part of the wonderfulness of Amos's novels, the ones I like most anyway, are always constantly being torn, you know, moved from one of those poles of speech, of literature, of effusion, and to something, an attempt to be something more kind of more hard-edged, quieter, and neither quite succeed.
So that back and forth is also something that we see in his relationship, in relation to the world.
It's true. I should say, Clémence, sorry to interrupt you. It's true, because I didn't really answer your question, but that I think is true of Israel as well, isn't it? I mean, very crudely, it's Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, but not just Jerusalem, kibbutz, but that was true certainly of Israel at a certain time anyway, I think. Sorry. Yeah.
Right, and that Israel of a certain time is the Israel of Amos's childhood. And I wanted to go back a little bit in time before we jump into the kibbutz years again, and talk about the motive of the child facing the world, facing history. So youth in the weight of history that runs through the work. Amos tells the story of the youth of the country and of a young boy in fictionalized ways and in autobiographical ways. So in the novel, in the Panther in the Basement, but also in a Tale of Love and Darkness, as you've mentioned. And so I'd like to now conjure up the spirits of Hugh Bonneville, who interviewed Amos for a documentary on Jesus, and who will now read a passage of A Tale of Love and Darkness for us from the extraordinary translation by Nicolas Delange, so that we get a sense also how this bookish child expanded his world, and so how the world became his as well.
Books were the slender lifeline that attached our submarine to the outside world. We were surrounded on all sides by mountains, caves, and deserts, the British, the Arabs, and the underground fighters, salvos of machine gun fire in the night, explosions, ambushes, arrests, house-to-house searches, stifled dread of what still awaited us in the days to come. Among all these, the slender lifeline still wound its way to the real world. In the real world, there were the lake and the forest, the cottage, the field and the meadow, and also the palace, with its turrets, cornices, and gables. There, the foyer, embellished with gold, velvet, and crystal, was lit by chandeliers with a mass of lights like the 7 heavens. In those years, as I said, I hoped I would grow up to be a book. Not a writer, but a book. And that was from fear. because it was slowly dawning on those whose families had not arrived in Israel that the Germans had killed them all. There was fear in Jerusalem, but people tried as hard as they could to bury it deep inside their chests. Rommel's tanks had reached almost to the gateway of the land of Israel. Italian planes had bombed Tel Aviv and Haifa during the war, and who knew what the British might do to us before they left? And after they had left, hordes of bloodthirsty Arabs, millions of fanatical Muslims, would be bound to butcher the whole lot of us in a few days. They would not leave a single child alive. Naturally, the grown-ups tried hard not to talk about these horrors in the presence of children, at any rate not in Hebrew. But sometimes a word slipped through or somebody cried out in his sleep. All our flats were as tiny and cramped as cages. In the evening, after lights out, I could hear them whispering in the kitchen over tea and biscuits, and I caught Chelmno, Nazis, Vilna, partisans, Actionen, death camps, death trains, Uncle David and Aunt Malka and little cousin Daniel, who was the same age as me. Somehow the fear got into me. Children of your age don't always grow up. Sometimes bad people come and kill them in the cradle or in kindergarten. In Nehemiah Street once there was a bookbinder who had a nervous breakdown, and he went out on his balcony and screamed, "Jews, help, hurry, soon they'll burn us all." The air was heavy with dread, and I may have already gathered how easy it is to kill people. Books are not difficult to burn either, it's true, but if I grew up to be a book, there was a good chance that at least one copy might manage to survive. If not here, then in some other country, in some city, in some remote library, in a corner of some God-forsaken bookcase. After all, I'd seen with my own eyes how books managed to hide away in the dusty darkness between the crowded rows, underneath heaps of off-prints and journals, or find a hiding place behind other books.
All right, thanks for this reading, Hugh Bonneville. Do you have any reactions or things that you'd like that this passage does invoke? Anything that you'd like to? All right, so I wanted to also continue chronologically in the youth of Amos Oz. Obviously, tragedy looms actually everywhere in the passage we just heard, but there was another one coming. And in a tribute to Amos Oz in The Observer, David Grossman said that the tragedy of his mother's death was probably the key to Amos's work, and that's obviously in A Tale of Love and Darkness. And so my question goes to Fania. How do you see your father's writing as a response to loss in general, and this loss in particular? And was that book a way to break the silence that came with the loss of his mother?
Well, as we know, no great book is based on one key alone, and no great author flies on one engine. It is absolutely clear, I think, that the death of my grandmother, I'm called by her name, was a calamity that informed my father's life and possibly in our family generations to come. It was not the only key. And he, about 10 years before he chose to disclose the story, to open up the story of Fania's life and death to the world in A Tale of Love and Darkness, he famously said something else about the keys of his literature, of his writing. He said that every writer needs 3 elements in his or her childhood: a wound, an injury, a grandmother, and a roof. And he had all 3 when he was a child. He had injury, possibly also before the death of his mother during the last years of her sad, complicated life. He had a grandmother, two of them, and his father, who was full of information, and his mother, as long as she was alive, who was full of stories. And he had the roof of their tiny little dark apartment at the edge of Jerusalem. I climbed up there and looked around, and I think I saw what he meant. So you need these three, and possibly beyond the injury, some kind of a great calamity early in life in order to become perhaps a great writer, who knows. But I think the key was his language more than anything. That Hebrew we were talking about before, the Hebrew that he swam in, that was the violin on which my father played. His mother was a torn string of that violin.
Oh, that's beautiful. Since you mentioned Hebrew as a place in which, generative, there's also something about the interiority of his Hebrew and a sort of interior exile that's another one of our contributors for this event meant to highlight in her comments. So I'd like us to listen now what the French writer Valérie Zenatti has to say about Amos's work. She was a translator of Aaron Appelfeld's work into French, another major writer in Israel, and Valérie reflects on the meaning of what she described as this interior exile in Hebrew.
Bonjour, je souhaite évoquer avec vous et pour vous un aspect dans l'œuvre d'Amos Oz qui me frappe et m'intéresse particulièrement et qui est celui de l'exil intérieur. Je précise tout de suite que je ne suis absolument pas une spécialiste de son œuvre, d'Amos Oz, mais j'exprime ici une position de lectrice. D'ailleurs, à titre personnel, je dirais que le premier livre que je vais évoquer, qui est mon Michael Shelley, est un des premiers livres que j'ai lu en hébreu lorsque j'ai fait mes études en Israël. Donc, ça a été un de mes premiers contacts avec la littérature israélienne contemporaine. Et dans ce texte, qui date de 1967, on trouve un personnage de femme, Hannah, qui est en décalage profond avec la réalité qui l'entoure, celle de Jérusalem, de la ville de Jérusalem, dans les années 50, peu de temps après la guerre d'indépendance, dans une réalité de contraintes et de rationnement assez forte. Et Hannah est plus absorbée par sa vie intérieure, ses rêveries, son imaginaire, que par la matérialité de la vie. Je me souviens qu'à l'époque, lorsque nous avions étudié ce texte, on avait comparé Hannah à Madame Bovary, et j'avais trouvé la comparaison intéressante, même si les deux sont dans des temps et des lieux différents. Il y avait peut-être cette particularité d'avoir une aspiration à quelque chose de plus grand que la réalité, de différent. Ce sentiment d'exil intérieur, je l'ai retrouvé presque à l'autre bout de l'œuvre d'Amos Oz, dans une histoire d'amour et de ténèbres, parue en Israël en 2002, et où pour le coup, il livre là un récit autobiographique très, très détaillé, où il aborde pour la première fois de cette manière-là, aussi frontale, le suicide de sa mère, qui était un tabou à l'époque où elle s'est suicidée, parce que dans un pays qui se construisait, idéologiquement, on ne pouvait pas accepter que quelqu'un souhaite se donner la mort. Et dans cette révélation, beaucoup de personnes ont vu une sorte d'analogie entre la mère d'Amos Oz et le personnage de Hannah, chose que lui-même a réfutée. Je ne pourrais pas dire que je pourrais trancher de manière construite, mais je dirais que ce sentiment d'exil intérieur de Hannah est également présent finalement chez cet écrivain qui est pourtant né en Israël, dans les paysages israéliens, dans les kibboutz, et qui, dès les premières pages d'une histoire d'amour et de ténèbres, parle du village européen ou du paysage européen tel qu'il en était imprégné sans y avoir jamais vécu. Le clocher, l'église, la rivière qui traverse la ville ou le village. Et cette sensation de déracinement géographique est, il me semble, aussi une caractéristique de cet exil intérieur, qui est à la fois intime, mais qui est peut-être aussi la marque de tous les grands écrivains.
So we just heard about this uprooting that's probably, as Valérie said, the signature of great writers. The uprooting in the case of Amos was also very much a lived experience when, as you mentioned earlier, he changed both his name and his life and decided to go live on a kibbutz. So Sir Simon Schama, he almost changed his name from Klausner to Oz, which, you know, in Hebrew means strength. And how would you describe this experience of the kibbutz, and how is that representative of a certain Israeli experience at this time? So you touched a little bit upon it already, but just really trying to situate it in the...
No, a lot of his most extraordinary writing, I think, actually sort of sets up the possibility of being well adjusted to kibbutz life. I mean, he himself works in the lul, in the chicken shed. Weirdly, an experience I had briefly. It's not the best place to work on a kibbutz, I can promise you, for all kinds of reasons. And in A Perfect Peace, the issue of Yonatan being the main protagonist of the book, being asked by his father to work in the tractor shed, in a tractor repair shop, and also to be at peace as well with the basic principles of a kibbutz, of commonalty, subscribing to what was then the kind of dominant ideology of Mapai, labor, all that tradition, a kind of socialist chalutz kind of feeling. But Amos always sets that up in order to break it apart. I mean, he's a sort of compassionate pessimist, really. It's never going to work for him, but it's never going to work for Israel. I mean, there's a sort of sense in which there's a ferocious but not absolutely merciless portrait of Levi Eshkol in A Perfect Peace, who comes to the kibbutz where, on the request of one of his old chaverim, who's the father of Yonatan, and as with some of the short stories as well, another veteran who appears. I think it's in Where the Jackals Howl, or is it from Scenes from Village Life? Pesach Kedem. Amos gives them their richness and their toughness and their kind of vital ebullience and their sense of kind of tanned hide strength, really, in the face of the legacy of catastrophic Jewish history. But it is always something which in his literature is ultimately attacked. There's something arid and ultimately a life lived as an opinion column, or as a set of opinions, actually. And Amos, of course, was massively not like that at all. So very often the kibbutz is a scene of the undoing of the kibbutz ideal. And in A Perfect Peace, which he wrote in the 80s, it's set again in the 60s, just at the moment. In retrospect, that's when I first came to Israel in the early 60s. That sort of world seemed to be able to go on forever. But, in retrospect, of course, it was not the beginning of the end, but the beginning of morphing into something which was a long way away from kibbutz idealism. So part of the extraordinary kind of strength in breadth of the way he writes about kibbutz life is to actually be humane about all the kind of world of characters you find in it, and at the same time realizing that it's an ideal that was completely, in some ways, inhumanly impossible to live up to. And I just add one more thing. It's very striking, again, in A Perfect Peace, that the kibbutzim are very often, again, as I discovered when I was at Bet Emek, built on or very close by ruins of Arab villages. And as Valérie was saying, landscape is incredibly important, and it very often is landscape with ruins. I mean, there's a very important scene where there's a kind of outing, a hike, a teal to an Arab village in which then something rather disturbing happens. And that's rather like the Going to Sheikh Jarrah, Tale of Love and Darkness, where there's in 1947 a kind of last possible idyllic moment. This is not a kibbutz setting at all, and something goes terribly wrong. So the kibbutz especially can be a scene of terrible accidents, actually, that sort of break up any possibility of fulfilling the satisfactory existence of a kibbutz life. I mean, real physical accidents happen, and electrocution. Fred, there were two fatal electric shock moments in his writing, both of which are horribly startling. So it's beautiful in that way, but it is also sort of fundamentally tragic, I think, really.
Well, this is tragic. This is beautiful. It's also a place. I mean, this is the genesis also of much of his writing. This is actually where he started writing, sitting on the toilet of his tiny home. Do you have memories of that time, Fania?
Yes, first I would like to congratulate Simon on these very accurate descriptions of my father's view of the old labor guard. It was an ironic awe. And in some ways, it also it was full of admiration, but it was a comic admiration in a way, because out there, and this I have to add here before my childhood memory, out there lay the desert, the darkness, the jackals, whatever is behind the funny little circle of lights that is called the kibbutz, or ideology, or socialism, or even liberalism, lies the great beyond. And this was not a facile Orientalism or something. It was something about the universe. My father pondered the universe in some of his works. And then coming to this little shaky home that was his own family house, that was the nation state of Israel, that was civilization in general. You know, so he kept wandering between desert and home, with all its flaws and shortbacks. And yes, he was writing My Michael, his second novel, the great novel, early novel. Sitting on the toilet seat at night as my mother was fast asleep in their one-bedroom apartment in the kibbutz. I was not there. I was in the children's home in the kibbutz. You know, it was a kind of half a boarding school experience. But I remember tiptoeing home from kindergarten or from school at 4 p.m. for those magical sunlit afternoon hours with the parents. And tiptoeing because he might be still asleep, and the siesta, the Schlafstunde, the afternoon nap was very important. Little did I know that it was so important for him, because he spent half the night writing in the little bathroom and then waking up at 5 or 6 to go out to work in the chicken shed or out on the tractor in the fields. So yes, I do remember what it felt like to have a father who tried to do two things at once, to be a Suntan kibbutz member and to be a writer almost in secret, and to be a wonderful dad into the bargain.
Wonderful. Professor Alter, Amos often described the kibbutz as a chorus, like in a Greek tragedy where everybody was observing everybody and commenting on people's actions. Do you think that this multitude of voices and points of view were also critical in his way of writing, and that's something that he, gathered along the way?
Well, I do, but before I address the question of the impact of the kibbutz, I'd like to go back to something Fania said earlier about the suicide of his mother is not the only subject either of his writing or specifically of a tale of love and darkness. That is, Amos did say in one of his late interviews that he thought that every writer needed a wound in order to create. Now, I don't think that's generally true. I think it's true for some writers. For example, Nabokov had a very happy childhood. And I don't even think that the Russian Revolution, when he was 17, was exactly traumatic for him. But the wound was certainly very true for Amos. At the same time, what I like to propose about A Tale of Love and Darkness, even though it ends with that shattering novelistic imagining of his mother's last hours until she put an end to her life. I don't think that that's the only purpose, maybe not even the main purpose of that book. I would propose that that book is really Amos's portrait of the artist as a young boy. It's about his coming to his vocation as a writer, and everything in the book really contributes to that. His crazy family history going back a couple of generations, the eccentrics and lunatics inhabiting the neighborhood in which you grew up in Jerusalem. And there's one moment which I sort of compare to Stephen Dedalus at the end of a portrait, looking out at the river and dedicating himself to forge the conscience of his race, when he's a 6-year-old and the sun is setting. It's an extraordinary piece of writing. And he suddenly realizes that everything he sees, everything he experiences, the spectacular colors of the sunset, the sound of a young girl practicing the piano, bird song, the smells, the laundry hanging from hanging out to dry, all this he has to remember. He has to remember, and someday he will commit it to writing. And he invokes a phrase from Agnon's modernist masterpiece, Only Yesterday. He says, a voice which brooks neither frivolity nor I forget how I translated it, neither frivolity nor superficiality tells him you have to write that. And that's a phrase that Yitzhak Kumar at the end of the Agnon novel here is applied to him before he dies. So writing is an imperative vocation, and he felt that all his life. Now, very briefly, I think you're right about the kibbutz. That is his formula ever since he read Sherwood Anderson's Winesburg, Ohio, was to focus on the microcosm and to make from the microcosm a macrocosm. And the kibbutz afforded that to him. He saw all around him not noble socialists implementing the socialist ideal, but people with their private demons, their frustrations, their quixotic fixations, and out of all that, he made the stuff of his novels. Let me add just one thing. I think that all his life, he somehow clung to the idea of the kibbutz. He clung to the idea of an egalitarian society, even though he knew, as Simon Schama pointed out, that it wasn't working.
Thank you, Professor Alter. There is, he clung to the idea of the kibbutz, but he also was one of the who undermined a certain image of the strong sabra, of the kibbutznik. So initially, the kibbutz and the Israeli experience was meant to be pitted against the diasporic meek Jew, and that was promoted by the state of Israel itself. Amos, however, brought a more nuanced perception of the kibbutz itself, of Israel. And I'd like us to now listen to Ruby Namdar, the wonderful novelist, winner of the Sapir Prize for The Ruined House. And to him, Amos Oz is essential because he challenged some of the stories that about Israel and the stories that Israel told itself. So let's listen to him.
Of course, there's a lot to say about Amos Oz's amazing wizardry of words, the connection to the Hebrew, his amazing eye for detail, and especially to beauty, his deep connection to beauty. But I actually want to speak about something else that is spoken perhaps a little less about, which is how Amos Oz introduced vulnerability to Hebrew literature of my youth. And today the word vulnerability is used a lot and sometimes too much. But we have to understand that at the time, Israeli society and culture was very Spartan, was very reserved, was very guarded, and you did not show vulnerability. It was almost a form of treason to speak the language of vulnerability. And then came Amos Oz from within the ethos, even though he always saw himself as an outsider. But he was also the golden boy of the kibbutz and the golden boy of Zionism and a golden sabra. At least that was the image that he created and the world wanted. And he spoke in a voice that was very uncommon, the voice of the vulnerable. I'm not speaking only about the fact that he experimented, and in my opinion, really successfully, with taking on the female voice, which was then almost unheard of, and spoke about within a female voice that was the opposite of maybe the ideal female of the time. I mean, his Hannah Gonen in My Michael was a depressed, introverted, urban intellectual. She was not at the heart of the ethos. He spoke the language of immigrants, of newcomers. He voiced a very deep, vulnerable side. Today, this does not seem so important because everybody is competing with each other about who's going to sound more vulnerable and then cash in on this. But at the time, it was really an epiphany to see an artist, a writer, dig into these pockets of vulnerability in his own soul in order to dish out that pigment of weakness and paint such amazing pictures with.
So that was a beautiful take by Ruby Namdar. Amos's work also straddled multiple tones and genres, channeled many voices, female voices, as we've heard. And this is most clear in The Same Sea. And this is what his Swedish publisher has to say about it.
So I would like to talk about Amos Oz, The Same Sea. Amos once said to me, "I'm not always proud of my books, but The Same Sea is one of them." He also said, "I'm surprised that I could write this book. It's like a cow giving birth to a bird." It differs from all his other novels in many ways. It's a unique piece, a novel by which Amos said that he would like to be remembered. It's like a choir singing, mixing prose, poetry, autobiographical pieces, just a beautiful and powerful narrative. It is Amos' most adventurous and inventive book. It intertwines lives, 4 voices, with domestic comedy in the musical language. For you who haven't read, we meet the middle-aged Albert, his wife, whom he has lost to cancer, and his son who wanders around the mountains of Tibet hoping to find himself, and his son's beautiful young girlfriend. This drama is a mix of fever dream of chaos and order, love and eroticism, loyalty and betrayal, and ultimately an extraordinary exposition of human nature. He paints an outstanding portrait of a choir, full of deep observations. Very special for this book is that you can start reading anywhere. It is fairly simple, the short episodes moving back and forth among the characters, looking towards the past, the present, and the future. Yet, for all that, or because of all that, because of the glimpses rather than the details, continuous narrative and the somewhat lighter touch of poetry rather than prose is a completely gripping tale. These lives and what happens to them is of great interest. Amos never explains too much. No one has like almost the power of words to tell.
Because of his art of bending genres, also his capacity of going from politics to literature and back, never betraying his vision, we all have a lot to learn from Amos. So let's now listen to how Eshkol Nevo, the acclaimed Israeli novelist, translated into many languages, remembers Amos as a teacher.
Amos Oz was my teacher. I was his student in a creative writing class in the Ben Gurion University for 2 years. And I want to tell you about 3 moments I had with him as a teacher, moments that I'm still carrying on with me. And the first moment was actually in the first lesson of the creative writing class. The first sentence Amos Oz said to us was, "I cannot teach you how to write, but I can teach you how to delete." This is how he opened the creative writing class, and since then I'm always thinking about deleting as another way or another form of writing. So this was my first encounter with him. Later on, another moment I can recall, a crucial moment maybe in my understanding of writing, a political text was brought to class, was brought to discussion by a student. Everybody read the text, and of course, Amos was leading the discussion. And then while analyzing the text, he said something like, "Ambivalence is a very good starting point when you want to write about social, political issues in a literary text." And he added, "When I write a political article, I will be very clear and sharp and decisive. But when I touch political issues in my books, I would try to understand the other side, to see the whole scope, to see into the depth of the personality of my characters instead of just stating my opinions." And then he kind of went back to the text that we were discussing, and he showed us how the most powerful moments of this text were the most ambivalent ones. And since then, whenever I'm ambivalent towards a story or a character, I feel, well, okay, it's a good starting point. The third moment was actually later on. Amos was teaching a course about Agnon, the Jewish writer, the Israeli Jewish writer, who won the Nobel Prize. And after the class, I went to him and I wanted to brag, actually. I wanted to tell him that I finally quit my day job and now I'm only writing. I'm completely devoted to writing. And then I told him that, and he looked at me in a very skeptical kind of a glance, and he said, "Well, you know, I never stopped everything in order to write. I always did a lot of things besides writing, and it was always writing and other things." And then he kind of said this sentence and went on to his next lesson. I remained standing there stunned. And now, it's been 20 years since this moment, and I think how wise it was of him to tell me that, because you can't be a writer without being involved.
You can be a writer without being involved. Our time is coming to an end. I'd like to ask you, what has Amos taught you? I'll really quickly, I'll start with Fania, of course. The answer is probably a lot, but so quickly, is there anything that you'd like to mention when thinking of Amos' legacy?
Thank you for the question. I lived with him for 58 years. I will try to make it really short. He taught me different things in different times. When I was very young, he already taught me the art of ironic love. We spoke about ironic awe before that, but he taught me that loving your own, that is your culture, your legacy, your country, your ideology, there should be an injection of irony into this love, and it took me many years to understand that this was a great antidote to fanaticism of all kinds. When he and I were middle-aged, more or less together, there are only 20 years apart between us, he taught me that although he writes about politics and literature with different pens, famously, as he said, it is the same hand that holds the pens, and empathy and multivocality and true listening, humble listening, are useful, indeed crucial, both for the writer of novels and for the writer of political texts, and for the way we think about politics. And when he was older, towards the end, he came up with an idea that we both loved and toyed with quite a bit, and that is the 11th commandment. And the 11th commandment, which more or less sums up the other 10, or at least 5 of them, is thou shalt not inflict pain on the other or on yourself. And if you have to inflict pain, make sure it's little pain as possible. I learned a great deal from him. I even taught him a little, but these 3 ideas are the outstanding ones, I think.
Thank you very much. Whoever wants to go next.
Okay. The thing that I learned from Amos, who was a good friend, was the model of a life lived courageously. Now, from the recorded conversations with 2 different women published after, well, one was published in his last year and the other after his death, we now know how terribly ravaged he was by the suicide of his mother, right to the end of his life, to the point where he said, "I'm worth nothing. How could a person be worth anything if his mother abandons him the way my mother did?" And yet, with the terror, the lifelong terror of contemplating his mother's death, he lived a resolute life. He did not sink into depression. He did not resort to alcohol or drugs. He was a remarkably responsible citizen of his country, and he dedicated himself to his work to the very end.
Thank you. For Simon Chama.
Well, it would be presumptuous to really, try and distill some sort of lesson, because I mean, I guess one lesson is for a writer, for me anyway, don't delude yourself into thinking you can ever remotely approach Amos's sort of encyclopedic expansiveness. I mean, when I think, Amos's books, I think when they work magnificently, as nearly all of them do, you have this extraordinary sensation not of reading them, but of living in them. And I think that's because every kind of element actually of generating the richness of life, by which I mean he was an extraordinary writer about animals, amazing writer about animals, or jackals, dogs, cats, Yeah, so there's a squirrel that occurs basically in one of his books. He was an astonishing writer about landscape of all kinds. We don't think of him as a great writer about Tel Aviv, and I think that wasn't, but actually when he does slip into the streets, particularly in the evening at night, you can smell and taste Tel Aviv, I think, really. So I suppose the great lesson is pretty much as Robert said, is his bravery, which was a literary as well as a moral and ethical and political bravery, I think. He was one of those writers, even when he's just on Kibbutz Hulda or when he's in boyhood streets of Jerusalem, that actually universalizes and just sort of embraces the richness of lives and an extraordinary kind of cast of characters. And that way, he is, I think, a kind of heir of Tolstoy, really, in that he has a kind of that's the tradition I think he has, rather than he's the ultimate fox rather than a furtive monomaniacal hedgehog. I
think that Amos being a fox rather than a hedgehog is going to be the final word. I'd like to, our time is running out, but I'd like to close with a glimpse of how Amos's words still reverberate across the world. And this will take us to high school in Paris, where the students do engage with Amos's literature, as you'll see.
J'ai découvert Amos Oz à travers l'une de ses œuvres qui s'intitule « Seule la mer » et j'ai eu un véritable coup de cœur pour l'écrivain, pour le roman. Ensuite, j'ai reçu une proposition d'accompagnement d'œuvres en lien avec les programmes de français et l'éditeur proposait la lecture de Soudain dans la forêt profonde. J'ai lu le récit, j'ai adoré et il m'a semblé essentiel de pouvoir le faire étudier à mes élèves parce qu'il y a un véritable message humaniste dans ce récit.
Aujourd'hui, donc, nous allons faire le bilan de l'œuvre que nous avons étudiée ensemble, Soudain dans la forêt profonde, d'Amos Oz. J'aimerais bien que Elliot puisse lire son petit passage.
Maya et Mati étaient les seuls sur qui les forêts profondes exerçaient une telle fascination, au point qu'ils rêvaient de découvrir ce que dissimulaient les sous-bois.
Et ça leur a permis du coup de découvrir la fameuse vérité qu'on leur cachait depuis qu'ils étaient nés.
Et aussi, ça peut être bien parfois de transgresser en fait l'interdit, comme ils l'ont fait, parce qu'en fait, au final, ils ont aidé quelqu'un.
Nimi était dans la lune et perpétuellement enrhumé. En plus, il avait les dents d'en haut écartées et proéminentes. Les autres appelaient cet interstice bouche d'égout. J'ai sélectionné ce passage car le thème du harcèlement est évoqué.
J'avais aussi pensé que dans les livres sur le petit Nimi, que c'est pas parce qu'une personne est différente qu'il faut forcément la mettre à l'écart.
Le fait est que la folie règne chez nous. C'est de l'histoire ancienne, mais je préfère que tu n'en saches rien. Lorsqu'on est ignorant, on ne peut pas se sentir coupable.
Quel est selon vous le message ?
Je pense que ça fait référence à la Shoah.
Ça parle de mémoire.
Un beau jour, qui sait, il y aura un revirement et nous redescendrons de la montagne. Et peut-être que, dotés d'un supplément d'âme, chaque créature, homme, bête et oiseau, tous les carnivores mangeront des carnélias au lieu de chasser leur proie.
Une fois assouvie, ma soif de vengeance se détachera de moi comme une meute de serpent.
Pourquoi est-il important, ce passage, ce dernier passage qui clôture quasiment l'œuvre ?
Ça reflète un peu, du coup, ce que Amos Oz, il voulait juste de la paix. Et là, il dit qu'un jour, peut-être que, comme Maya a dit, il pourrait pardonner. Et peut-être que tout sera en paix comme avant. Comme Amos Oz espérait, du coup.
One day, someday. So thank you all so much. This has been a fantastic conversation. The recording will be made available on the website, and I'll leave you with the words of the filmmaker Costa-Gavras, the acclaimed director of Z, The Confession, or Amen, who was inspired by Amos in many ways, as you'll hear. And since we will be in film territory, this will be followed by Katia Shelley's teaser for her documentary dedicated to Amos Oz's literature. Katya was a dear friend of Amos, and her project was the inspiration for this event. So thank you so much to all the participants and to Katya for spearheading this. A crowdfunding campaign is to be set up to finance the making of this film, which will give us a more in-depth perspective on Amos Oz's writing and the man behind the books, the man who wanted to be a book. So let us continue to read, think, and be more alive with Amos. And thank you so much.
Non, je voudrais parler de Amos Oz, qui pour moi est un grand écrivain. Un grand écrivain contemporain, un grand écrivain qui a exploré le monde dans son entier, mais aussi plus particulièrement le monde israélien et juif. Je pense qu'il a une écriture absolument précise qui entre dans la qualité de l'homme, dans la préoccupation de l'homme et des femmes, bien sûr, et plus particulièrement dans ce que l'homme. Je crois que ce que fait Oz dans son œuvre, il essaye de se placer vraiment dans chacun de ses personnages, de parler de chacun de ses personnages comme s'il avait été lui-même, comme s'il connaissait exactement ses problèmes et ses amours, ses haines, ses difficultés dans la vie, etc. Et il le fait d'une manière formidable. C'est-à-dire qu'avec lui, on connaît le monde, on connaît l'autre femme ou homme, et on va profondément dans la société aussi, dans ce qui se passe dans les sociétés aujourd'hui. Et on peut dire que le monde n'est pas si tranquille, n'est pas ce qu'on souhaite qu'il se fût, et Oz l'explique très, très bien. Il y a des livres, par exemple, comme Soudain dans la forêt, que je trouve formidable. C'est une sorte de raconte, d'hymne, je dirais aussi, sur la sensibilité juive, sur la tradition juive, et on comprend beaucoup plus, pour nous, les gentils, les chrétiens, même si on ne l'est pas, on comprend beaucoup mieux ce monde qui parfois risque de nous ressembler éloigné. C'est ça la grande qualité de Oz. J'ai eu aussi l'occasion de rencontrer l'homme, de discuter avec lui, et j'ai vu sa générosité, sa façon d'approcher les problèmes les plus sérieux, notamment celui qui concerne l'Israël et la Palestine. Et j'ai vu la netteté de ses idées et l'humanité de sa pensée dans ces grands problèmes qui souhaitent qu'il ne soit pas aussi négatif qu'il le fut et qu'il continue de l'être aujourd'hui. Voilà. Je pourrais parler beaucoup plus longuement de son œuvre, mais je préfère en rester là et dire que tout ce qu'il peut faire, c'est lui, pour qu'il soit connu dans le monde, à travers des écrits ou à travers du cinéma et des films, ça serait une chose formidable. Pas seulement pour lui, mais surtout pour ceux qui vont le lire, pour ceux qui vont essayer de le comprendre, pour ceux qui vont voyager à travers ses livres.
This was the very early child's intuition that life may be very, very short for people like me, for Jerusalem Jews. And therefore I thought, in a childish way, it's safer to be a book than to be a human being, because a copy of me will survive somewhere.
It was here in Kibbutz Hulda in early 1979 that I first got to know Amos Oz. A strong friendship took root. He gradually became a powerful father figure. But death snatched Amos from life too soon. His armchair is empty, and I am left with so many unanswered questions. Why is it only after our loved ones are gone that we realize what we should have asked them? You, who spoke so little about yourself, wanted to be a book and wrote so many.
Amos has left us a unique legacy, a body of work, novels, short stories, essays.
Now, they are all that remain to understand you better. It was only when I read A Tale of Love and Darkness that I learned the tragedy of your mother's suicide.
Walking over to my father and saying, how can that be? Because he'd only told me that she died before I was born, and there was very little about her in the house ever.
This is something that he held within him all his life, and he was never ready to mourn over her.
I wrote the book putting myself not only in the shoes but under the skin of my mother.
You turned away when speaking of your mother. Did writing ever help to forgive her and find peace? Feeling protective, I never spoke to you about her. You, who had written so many books, told me that your very last novel, Judas, was a real battle for you. Why?
Usually, when Amos wanted to get rid of a book, he would tear it up. But this time he didn't tear it.
Why? And why did you totally black out certain words? I have so many questions. Now, those close to you and your work, all over the world, will help me to unravel mysteries of your life through your writing.